Right. Uh, we were talking about John Dryden, the preeminent poet living between 1631 and 1700. And we are suggesting that this presentation is a brief introduction to his life and times, that Dryden was living through some of the most extraordinary events of the century, including the Civil War and the Restoration. I also pointed out to you that Dryden was Poet Laureate from 1668 to 1688, so 20 years. You see that this period coincided with the Catholic monarchy. So Dryden was squarely placed within the Catholic part of the rule, and from 1688 onwards, when the Protestant King William comes to the throne, Dryden is cast off from power, as it were, and he loses his poet laureateship. And this was not only true of Dryden, but of all other poets as well. They were closely associated, the literature of the period was closely associated to the political affiliations of the poets. Right. Now, the first verse satirist, although one might argue that in 1658, Samuel Butler was publishing Hudibras, which preceded Dryden a little bit, but he was the preeminent poet of the period, one of the most important dramatists of the period, who wrote both Restoration comedies and heroic tragedies, and also the father of English criticism, in the sense that he wrote a few quite extraordinarily important treatises on literature, which I will discuss in a brief. While Dryden was, of course, shaping the English theatre after the opening of the theatres in 1658, and also writing almost 27 plays, including, as I said, Restoration comedy and heroic tragedy. Now, Dryden is born on August the 9th, and he is part of a Puritan gentry family. He's born in Northamptonshire, and attended the village school. His formal education is under the Royalist Anglican headmaster Richard Busby, and it is, it is given out. There's a story that Busby actually locked his students all up the day that Charles I was beheaded. Dryden was at school at that point of time, and therefore Dryden's early training in this particular school was in the classics, Latin, Greek classics, which would actually shape much of his literary career later on. He would later on, of course, translate Horace, Juvenal, Ovid, and so on and so forth. So closely associated Dryden was from his childhood with classical literature. 1650 is going to Cambridge, and 1654 he receives his degree, and then Dryden starts to work with Cromwell's secretary, and therefore during this period Cromwell becomes Dryden's hero, as it were, a mentor, as it were, and his stance is greatly in favor of the interregnum, greatly in favor of the Commonwealth, as it were. And in 1658, when Cromwell dies, Dryden publishes his first major poetry, Heroic Stanzas to the Glorious Memories of Cromwell. Now, Dryden will, of course, later on have this ascribed to him that he frequently changed sides. Therefore, when Charles II comes back, Dryden shifts his allegiances from the Commonwealth to the Royalists, and therefore he writes a poem called Astra Redux, Justice Brought Back, which is a panegyric upon Charles II and his return to monarchy. And Dryden suggests that with Charles's return, there is an establishment of order and harmony within the English kingdom. Right. So just within 2 years, Dryden has changed sides from the Commonwealth to the Royalists. As I point out, Dryden was known for his flexible allegiances, not only in politics, but also in terms of his religion. Right. Now, from this point onwards, Dryden starts residing with Sir Robert Howard, and he becomes an editor and collaborator, and Howard becomes a patron for Dryden. Now, you see, at this point of time, you will have to understand that literature was still not a profession as such. You did not earn much money, although this was gradually changing. But either you wrote for the professional stage, as Shakespeare and Marlowe did, or you had to have a patron. A patron was somebody who provided you money or a pension, and you could indulge in your practice of writing. So very obviously, what happened was that the writers would write also for their patrons. So whatever their independence was largely curbed. Now this changed once the novel started growing, and in 1750, and when print culture developed even more. Right? How did people sell books at that point of time? They raised subscriptions. So if I said I would translate, say, Juvenal, then I would put an advertisement out in the newspapers that I'm sort of translating Juvenal. Please subscribe. So people would send advance subscriptions for the copies. And I would print, say, 300 copies if I had received 200 subscriptions, and I would send them the copy at a certain price. Therefore, you did not yet have a print industry as such. Therefore, Dryden was dependent upon the patronage, and Robert Howard provided this patronage and allowed Dryden to write. This, I am saying, would change in the 18th century. And in 1754, Dr. Samuel Johnson actually wrote a letter which signified the end of the decade of patronage. And from that point onwards, literary writers became far more independent. Right? So Howard also connected with the theatre troupe, and in 1663, Dryden publishes his first play, The Wild Gallant. And The Wild Gallant did not do very well on the theatrical stage, but Dryden had started writing plays from this point onwards. Now, in 1664, therefore, Dryden is writing heroic plays, and you have The Indian Queen, written in all rhymes, and 1665, the plague breaks out. So Dryden's just started embarking on a literary career. The plague breaks out in 1665, continues till January 1666, and therefore, all the theaters are closed down. Therefore, there's a brief respite for Dryden. Dryden therefore retires to the country estate and writes a very major essay of the period titled Essay of Dramatic Poesy. Now, I'll just briefly linger on this essay for a moment, because this is an important critical work. Now, in this, Dryden suggests that English theatre is making a different venture from French classical theatre. Now, at this point of time, all the models for English theatre were French, primarily because English theatre had been shut down. And therefore, the English playwrights were imitating the French comic writers as well as the tragic writers. So Molière, the French comic writer, became a model for British comedy. Now, Dryden was suggesting that England had an indigenous tradition of comic writing, of playwriting, theatre, and that the preeminent theatre writer of that period was Shakespeare. And Dryden is talking about the modes of neoclassical drama, the maintenance of rules. It is also liberal in suggesting that Shakespeare was violating the unities of time and place and mixing tragedy and comedy. Even then, he was holding up the mirror to nature. Dryden's argument was that in life, joy and woe, joy and grief, are coterminous coexistence. Therefore, Shakespeare was being realistic in his depiction and mixing of the genres. This is Dryden's defense of Shakespeare. But what is interesting is that Dryden is suggesting a new nationalism in England, which is trying to distinguish itself from the French tradition and suggesting that the English dramatic tradition is independent and it is a vital tradition with a degree of excellence. So very clearly in his essay of dramatic poesy, Dryden is therefore trying to establish the supremacy of British theatre over French theatre, over French contemporary theatre. So this is a landmark essay in that sense of the term, and it also initiates what we will call the Shakespeare criticism, whereby Shakespeare becomes the English icon whose theatre is held up as an example of great British drama. You will find that this will be reiterated by numerous critics later on, including Samuel Johnson's preface to Shakespeare. Later on, even the Romantics will write on Shakespeare. And of course, you have the entire modernists also writing on Shakespearean drama. So a new nationalism is what I'm looking at, a new British nationalism, British identity in theatre, although Dryden and his contemporaries were borrowing heavily from classical and French traditions. So, essay of dramatic poesy, Dryden writes during the plague, and in 1667, Dryden returns to London and writes a poem called Annus Mirabilis. This was also about the Great Fire of London. You remember that 1665 is the plague, where 1/3 of the people of London die. 1666 is the Great Fire of London, where almost 1/3 of London's buildings are destroyed. So London is being rebuilt, and Dryden is writing Annus Mirabilis on the events of 1666, which he calls the Year of Wonders. Right. So Dryden, therefore, is squarely involved in writing about the politics, in writing about the contemporary events of the period. Now, gradually the theatre becomes his primary source of income at this point of time, and he starts gaining both reputation and money as a dramatist. Now, by 1668, Dryden has become the poet laureate. Therefore, he is now the preeminent poet of England. He has a solid financial stability. And by the end of 1670, he's also the royal historiographer. By this time, in 1662, he had also become a member of the Royal Society, but somehow science did not interest him that much. He did not pay his dues and was thrown out from the society. Now, in 1670, he's writing heroic tragedies one after the other. And his best, probably his finest tragedy, The Conquestors of Granada, the heroic play, is published. And in this period, he's also coming up into a feud with numerous royalist critics. You have, for example, his spat with the Duke of Buckingham, and Dryden is engaging in both literary feuds as well as political disputes. Now, you'll have to understand that the poetomachia, M-A-C-H-I-A, machia is war. So the poetomachia of the period was closely involved with the political turbulence of the period. So poets were both engaged in personal disputes as well as political disputes. So there were two kinds of registers or languages going on. One was the language of politics, and the other was the language of poetry. But you have to understand that during this period, the politics of language and the politics, the politics of politics and the politics of poetry were closely being intertwined. And it is in this spirit that Dryden engages in numerous disputes with his political as well as his poetic rivals. During this period, one of his rivals is the Whig poet Thomas Shadwell. Now, Shadwell is going to be the protagonist of MacFleckner. Now, Shadwell was a dramatist of considerable renown, but Shadwell wrote a different kind of play. He was writing Johnsonian plays of humors. What was the Johnsonian play of humors? The Johnsonian comedy of humors believed in the Galenic tradition of medicine that all the body was constituted of four humors. Four humors related with the four major elements. So our body was in balance when the four elements or the four humors were in perfect proportion. If any humor was bloated or predominant, then we had a sickness. And the comedy of humors suggested that because of this disbalance of the humors, laughter could cure us, alert us to this disbalance of the humor, and thereby serve as corrective. Yesterday, when I was talking, I reminded you how comedy was seen as a corrective form of literature. Right. So Dryden at this point of time is, of course, writing heroic tragedies. Please excuse me for a moment. Is writing heroic tragedies and is deeply influenced by the classical tradition. Right. Okay. Now, during this period, Dryden's company faces a crisis because the theaters is burnt down, and he then starts to shift. Dryden wrote that he never really liked writing theaters that much, and he shifted to writing further heroic drama like Aurangzeb. In fact, this was published in 1675. And from Aurangzeb, Dryden would move away from the tradition of heroic tragedy to writing plays which were more comic in that sense of the term. He was experimenting with restoration comedy. Now, you need to understand also, although somebody else will be doing restoration comedy with you, what restoration comedy was doing. Now, restoration comedy, unlike Johnsonian comedy, was based on wit and repartee. Repartee, R-E-P-A-R-T-E-E, was quick exchanges, quick and witty dialogue. So the play was no longer based on the humor within the character. The play was based on a dramatic situation and based on quick exchange of witty dialogue. Now, Restoration comedy was largely courtly comedy because it was performed in the court. It consisted of aristocratic characters. It largely depended on extramarital affairs between couples, and therefore there was a sexual promiscuity and licentiousness. It looked down on the country people as rustics. Therefore, it was an exclusive comedy which had a very strong amoral bias or immoral bias, and it was performed for the court, by the court. Therefore, there was a lot of resentment, popular puritanical resentment against the comedy of manners, is what Restoration comedy was known as, because it was very stylized, both in terms of the characters, in terms of the dialogues. And therefore, you had in 1698 a person called Jeremy Collier, who protested against the immorality and profanity. Profanity is bad language. Immorality and profanity on the English stage. This is 1698. So you have a puritanical backlash. By this time, Dryden has already written several Restoration comedies. But in 1700, he writes his final major Restoration comedy called The Way of the World. Right. Now, in 1680s, Dryden is turning to poetry. And this is provoked by a political event. What was this political event? That Charles II, who was the king, remember, at this point of time, bastard son, right? Charles's illegitimate son, the Duke of Monmouth, he staged a rebellion against Charles. And after Charles's death, he wanted to become the monarch, and he was aided by the Whig, the Earl of Shaftesbury, right? And therefore, and the rebellion was put down, and and Monmouth, who is characterized by Dryden as Absalom, the biblical Absalom, was put to trial where he was acquitted. Now, this entire event of the attempted rebellion, the charges of treason, and the trial and the dismissal of the trial, the liberation of Monmouth, provoked numerous political satires. The chief among them was Dryden's Absalom and Achitophel. Now, in this poem, Dryden suggests that King Charles is like David, the biblical monarch, against whom Absalom, that is Monmouth, rebels, and Achitophel, that is the Earl of Shaftesbury, is the Satan who provokes Absalom to rebel against his king. Now, this poem was meant to influence the jury who was examining the case. But then, of course, the jury acquitted Monmouth and and Shaftesbury, and therefore the rival poets started writing satires as well. And chief among them was Shadwell. Thomas Shadwell wrote a poem titled please excuse me. The rival poets celebrated by publishing a medal. They built a medal in honor of this acquittal, and Dryden wrote a poem titled The Medal. Now, the medal provoked a poem by Shadwell titled The Medal of John Bayes, B-A-Y-E-S. Dryden was often referred to as Bayes. Therefore, Shadwell was directly attacking Dryden. Let me reiterate. 1680s, you have the rebellion against Charles II by his bastard son, the Duke of Monmouth. This is also aided by the Earl of Shaftesbury, and of course the Duke of Buckingham, whom you saw as Zimri. So these people were rebelling against the king. Dryden writes a satire called Absalom and Achitophel, where Monmouth is Absalom rebelling against the King David, whereas Shaftesbury is Achitophel, who is like Satan egging on the Duke of Monmouth. This poem was written to influence the jury in the trial, but in the trial, Monmouth and Shaftesbury won. They were acquitted, and it was celebrated by the building of a medal. Dryden satirized this event by writing a poem called The Medal. Shadwell, the rival poet, wrote a poem against the medal, which was titled The Medal of John Bayes. And Dryden comes, now indignant and extremely angry with Shadwell, writes a corrosive satire called MacFleckner. So this is how the Poetomachia, the war of the poets, was played out. And you can see the political context within which this Poetomachia is being played out. Right. So the medal, MacFleckner, published 1682, and by 1684, Dryden is England's leading poet. Now, one or two points about MacFleckner. It was using what is called the heroic couplet, and Dryden was establishing this as the form of English satire over the next few years. I will explain what the heroic couplet is later on when we discuss the text. Dryden was also using the mock heroic, mock epic format here. So this also became the template for writing most of the satires, as we shall see when we'll take a look at a few lines from the Dunciad, which you have chosen. Therefore, Dryden is establishing the conventions and formal features of English satire during this period. Right. So therein lies the importance of Dryden as the preeminent poet. So already you can see his multifarious talents. He's become England's major dramatist, both in terms of heroic tragedy and restoration comedy. He has written extensive literary criticism and will continue to do so. He's one of England's first and major critics, and he's also England's finest satirist at this point of time. And he's also involved in the political turmoil of the period, firmly on behalf of the royalists. Please remember, till this time, Dryden is a Protestant by faith. And he has already written a religious satire called Religio Laici, Laici, where he has defended the Protestant faith. But he has argued also for moderation and permission for all faiths. Right, Dryden in that sense was a religious moderate, but he's a Protestant at this point of time. Now in 1685, following the deathbed conversion of Charles II and James coming to the throne, James II rather, James III first of course came to the throne in 1603. Now the Catholic brother comes to the throne, and Charles II, you see, on the deathbed he becomes a Catholic. So Dryden also converts Dryden also converts to Catholicism. And this once again raised this entire debate about Dryden being an opportunist who changed his positions just as he had changed his positions from Cromwell to Charles. So also is changing from Protestantism to the Catholic faith. But grant him this much, that Dryden, of course, remained a Catholic till his last days. But during this period, he writes another poem called The Hind and the Panther. So he'd already written Religio Laici earlier. Now he writes The Hind and the Panther. Religio Laici was a defense of the Protestant faith. The Hind and the Panther is a defense of the Catholic faith. Right? So Dryden could, waver from faith to faith also. Right? Now, in 1688, the Glorious Revolution happens. The Protestant William and his Queen Mary now come to the throne. You see how important the understanding of history is. Until and unless you have attended those history classes, you will not understand what is happening. So the Catholic James is deposed. William and Mary come from Holland through the Glorious Revolution. And by 1689, Dryden is no longer in favor because he's a Catholic, he's a royalist. And therefore, William and Mary strip him from the post of poet laureateship. And who is made the royal poet? Irony of ironies, it is his rival poet, the target of MacFleckner, Thomas Shadwell. So Shadwell now becomes the new royal poet. Now, from this point onwards, from 1689 to 1700, when Dryden passes away, he is largely ignored in court. He's discriminated against, and therefore he becomes aloof from the courtly politics. But as you see, in 1692, he once again writes the Original and Progress of Satire, which we have already read. He's also now engaged in translating the classics, and he's translating the classics, including Virgil's Aeneid. He's also translating a lot of other poets, including Juvenal, Persius, Horace, and therefore it is these translations that get tremendous critical acclaim, and Dryden is established as the great classical translator of Roman poetry. Now, it is at this point of time that his finances also improve because he's gathering subscriptions for his translations. You remember that it is one of those translations which has the Original and Progress of Satire as a prefatory note, and therefore Dryden is cementing his place as the most classical, the learned, and sophisticated poet of the Restoration period. Now, his last work is, of course, called Fables, Ancient and Modern, which he published once again just before he died in 1700. Right, he's buried first in St. Anne's Church locally, and then his body is exhumed 10 days later, and is placed and is buried right next to Chaucer in Westminster Abbey in the corner of the poets. Now, this is the great critical acclaim. It just shows the great critical acclaim with which Dryden was held during this period. Now, please remember that, therefore, if you evaluate Dryden, you maintain a few salient points. One, that he lived through the most interesting period of English history, probably. He closely observed the Civil War. He was part of Cromwell's supporters in his early years. Then he changed sides, supported Charles II, became both the royal historiographer and the royal poet. supported the Protestant cause at this point of time, was the preeminent writer of plays including heroic tragedies and restoration comedies, writing 27 plays and primarily earning a living out of his theatre. He was one of the most important critics of the period, initiating Shakespeare criticism through Essay of Dramatic Poesy. And then he moves on also to write The Original and Progress of Satire. So Dryden's point as or position as a critic is preeminent. One of the finest writers of satire during the period, started the practice of heroic couplets. He was also sort of instrumental, I would say, in initiating the translation of the classical poets, and therefore was acclaimed as one of the Restoration's greatest littérateurs, literary figures. His satires would influence Alexander Pope tremendously in the next few years, and his Restoration comedies, especially The Way of the World, would be recognized as probably the greatest example of the comedy of manners. Please remember that during this time, he is engaged in numerous conflicts. As a Tory, he is engaged in conflict with the Whigs. That is to say, as a royalist, he is engaged in conflict with the parliamentarians. As a royalist against the parliamentarians, as first a Catholic, first a Protestant against the Catholics, and then a Catholic against the Protestants. Right. So he changed sides, but all these political and religious conflicts were also embedded in his literary works. Now, the poem that we will read, of course, is MacFleckner, and therefore I will very briefly talk about the context of MacFleckner. I've already told you the context. Even then, let me repeat. Dryden and Shadwell were engaged in a conflict from the 1670s onwards. Dryden supported the royalists, and the party which supported the royalists during this period was called the Tory party, the Conservative party. The party which supported the parliamentarians was called the Whig party, W-H-I-G, the Whig party. Shadwell belonged to this Whig party. Now, Dryden was mocked at in a poem called The Rehearsal, and Shadwell also sort of wrote a few satires which targeted John Dryden. You know, in a play called The Virtuoso, Shadwell was also writing Restoration comedies during this period, although they were comedies of humors rather than comedies of manners. Shadwell wrote in 1676 a play called Virtuoso, and in 1668 he had written Sullen Lovers, both of which mocked Dryden. Now, it is during this period that the enmity sort of developed. Now, the popish plot, the plot which was raised by Monmouth against King Charles, brought this conflict into both a political and a poetic mode. Dryden was writing for Charles, Shadwell was writing for Monmouth. Therefore, when the trial took place, Dryden wrote Absalom and Achitophel to influence the jury. The jury acquitted Monmouth. Therefore, Dryden's poem was failed as a kind of a political pamphlet. And In celebration of Monmouth's release, the Whigs published a medal. Dryden wrote a satire against this through his poem titled The Medal. Shadwell responded by writing a poem called The Medal of John Bays. And therefore, personal and political enmity came together in the writing of MacFleckner, which lampooned and used the Juvenalian mood to attack Shadwell. This is the context within which MacFleckner was written. So you will find that MacFleckner is titled The True Blue Protestant Poet. So once again, there are certain references which are being made. So religion, politics, and personal enmity are coming together in the writing or in the creation of MacFleckner. Right. Now, it is important to also understand, you can read through the study material that I have sent you. You see, this is all happening in around 1681, 1682. The Medal of John Bays was written by Shadwell at this point of time. And the medal, of course, is also written in 1682 by Dryden, where he attacks Shaftesbury. And Shaftesbury and his followers are referred to as ignorant fools, dunces, and Charles's case is argued for. And therefore, Dryden is talking not only about Shadwell, but also about the people of London who engaged in the Popish plot. Now, what were the reasons for this quarrel? Was it just a personal quarrel? We've already seen the political context, but there's also a theatrical context. Shadwell was a practitioner of the Johnsonian comedy of humors. Dryden rated Johnson, Ben Jonson, this is Jonson, but his own favorite mode of comedy was the comedy of manners, the Restoration comedy of wit, dialogue, and situations, rather than the comedy of manners, which was based on type characters and stock situations. Therefore, they disagreed, Johnson and Shadwell and Dryden, on the nature of comedy also. Which comedy was superior? Was it Johnsonian comedy or was it manners comedy? Shadwell said Johnsonian comedy. Dryden said the comedy of manners. Right. So the preference of Dryden was for the comedy of wit and repartee, and of Shadwell, the chief disciple of Johnson, for humorous comedy. There's also this argument about whether rhyme should be used in poetry and plays. Dryden spoke in favor of rhyme. Shadwell often dispensed with rhyme. And therefore, there was also this conflict about whether rhyme should be introduced in poetry and prose and theatre. And of course, there was this argument that Shadwell was plagiarizing, was borrowing, lifting from other writers. So these were therefore, the reasons for which during the 1682 period, England was in turmoil, both in politics, religion, as well as in the literary sphere. And the language of politics and the language of poetry was freely mixing with each other, with poets writing for rival political parties. And therefore, it is with these different strands, the political, the theatrical, the personal, and the religious, that we shall have to take a closer look at MacFleckner to suggest how personal and political conflicts we're going into the making of Dryden's Juvenalian satire to reduce Shadwell to the status of a fool and a dunce. I will argue later on that this is the model that Pope will also accept in the Dunciad. But remember that Dryden's Shadwell is not just a preeminent poet. Because remember, Shadwell and Dryden are almost equal in their eminence. What does Dryden make of Shadwell in MacFleckner? He makes Shadwell a symbol of folly, bokam, poor poetry, and also a representative of mass, popular, poor culture. Remember this, that the personal enmity was there, but Shadwell was a very important poet. But Dryden makes Shadwell not only a poor poet, but also a fool and a non-intelligent poet and dramatist who writes for money, and also somebody who belongs to Grub Street, and that is popular culture. What was Grub Street? Now, during this period, of course, cheap print culture was evolving. Print was becoming gradually cheaper. More and more people were becoming literate. Therefore, a lot of pamphlets were being published. There was a literature which was meant for the cheap consumption of the masses, of the people, the ordinary people. Now, what do the ordinary people want? They want sensation in literature. So this would be like broadsheets, libels, there were newspapers, there were pornographic tracts, biographies of prostitutes, which were called whore biographies, biographies of criminals. In general, a literature which was poor in taste, meant for consumption and pleasure. Now remember this, all of you, that all of you exist in two cultures simultaneously. When you go to the Shantiniketan Mandir and sing the Rabindra Sangeet, you are in high culture. Those of you who practice classical singing, high culture. You are reading Charles Dickens and you are reading Shakespeare, you are into high culture. At the same time, when you go home, you will probably take a look at the Amazon series called Patal Lok, and you will see a film by Shah Rukh Khan, and you will read all kinds of magazines which are all part of popular culture. So there are two kinds of culture: elite, high culture, and plebeian, popular culture. And therefore, there is always a conflict between high culture and popular culture. You see, the detective fiction, for example, was part and parcel of popular culture. Right? Now, when did this conflict begin? It began when print became cheap. And it is at this point of time. Therefore, the place from which these cheap popular texts were being published was a place called Moorfields, on the outskirts of London. On the outskirts of London. It is at this place that prostitutes used to stay, and prostitutes often acted in plays. This is the first time that women were acting in plays, and these women were almost always prostitutes. So at this place, Moorfields, you had prostitutes, you had gambling houses, you had beer baiting houses where people, sort of put money on cockfighting and beer fighting. Beer as in bear, as bhalluk, right? Therefore, this was a den of gambling. This was a den of prostitution. This was a den of theater people. And this was where the cheap printers, writers stayed. And these writers were often called hack writers. Who were hack writers? Hack writers were writers who would write for money. So if I wanted to write a libel against, say, Mr. X, I would go there and say, write a satire for me, will you? And they would write a satire or a pamphlet. These were therefore writers on hire. And therefore they were compared to prostitutes who had sex for money. These people had writings for money. Therefore these were called cheap hack writers. And they also resided in this place called Moorfields, which was a very low suburban area of London. And this place was popularly known as Grub Street. Grub as in the ditch which ran around Moorfields, this drain almost. So the gutter, the drain of the culture of the drain, low culture, only of very cheap taste, but very popular. Therefore, what Dryden does is he makes Shadwell an emblem of this cheap, poor culture. So you have to understand that in writing MacFleckner, Dryden was not only writing against a rival poet, he was also writing against a rival culture, a rival cheap popular culture which was swamping the print space. So MacFleckner is a satire at many levels. It's a personal satire against Shadwell with reference to his plays, his Johnsonian comedies, and so on and so forth. It is a satire against poor poetry. Shadwell becomes an emblem of poor poetry. Shadwell becomes an emblem also of folly, stupidity. Therefore, this is a satire against stupidity and folly. And finally, this is also a satire against low culture, low popular culture or Grub Street. Shadwell becomes the symbol. MacFleckner becomes the symbol of all these aspects. So please remember that there are two Shadwells. One is the poet Shadwell, who was a preeminent poet and dramatist of his period, a rival to Dryden. And there is the literary Shadwell, who is created by Dryden as a fool, who is created by Dryden as a poor poet and a representative of popular culture. Right? So it is in this way that we shall read MacFleckner from our next class onwards. What I have done today is given you the context of John Dryden. I've alerted you to the ways in which Dryden becomes both the preeminent dramatist and satirist of the period. We've already looked at the critical comments on satire that he makes, his distinction between Horatian and Juvenalian satire. And I'll argue that in MacFleckner, Dryden uses the Juvenalian mode to great effect in criticizing Shadwell at many levels. It is now with that I would like to end this class, and in our next class we shall take a detailed look at the text. At the undergraduate level you should read this text in greater detail to see how the art of satire, the mock heroic, the mock epic operates, and how Dryden successfully manages to satirize Shadwell at many levels. It is with that, therefore, that I am bringing this recording to a close.